Afghanistan is a particularly difficult area to photograph well.
Yes.
Because you're dealing with a landscape which in one sense is very arid. There is not a lot in some of the landscapes to actually draw your eye at first sight. So the test of a good photographer in Afghanistan is to work successfully with the landscape. Donovan, who worked as an Imperial War Museum official photographer, which meant that the Imperial War Museum took all the responsibility and had to make sure that he obeyed all the rules.
Were you actually worried throughout the project? I hadn't sort of thought about that side of it. Yes,
Well,
yes.
Whenever a photographer that I know goes off to a war zone like this, it is in the back of your mind. Generally speaking, the museum does not have a policy of sending civilian photographers to active war zones, because you are ultimately potentially responsible for sending them to their death, maybe.
Yes. Yes.
With Donovan, because he already had the experience of Iraq and the setup we were familiar with, we felt that in this case we could indeed support that.
Hilary, could you just explain exactly what an outpost in Afghanistan is?
Right, well, what we have here are two types of military base. You have a forward operating base, an FOB. The purpose of the FOB is to provide a secure defensive environment for troops, equipment, vehicles, food supplies, etc., etc. And then you have the outposts, which are fed by this FOB, which are surveillance and communications outposts. So the idea is to sort of monitor movement, enforce security, and communicate back to the base any issues, risks, operations, movements, whatever that you might see going on. The initial idea was that Donovan would embed with British forces in Helmand.
Right.
That proved too complicated because of events at the time, and so we decided to look at the Allies and the Canadians, whose experience in Afghanistan was proving very similar to the British. That was the origins of this particular project, going to Kandahar and embedding with the Canadians in particular. Embedding is a modern term, which means that a photographer who is not a member of the armed forces is attached to a military unit and accompanies them, works alongside them, has to obey their rules.
Yes.
In other words, if they say don't go here or don't photograph that, it doesn't happen.
Right.
They're not operating independently. They rely on the military unit for their protection and for their access. Working in Afghanistan on a freelance independent basis without protection is almost impossible. You only have to look at the terrain in some of these photographs to get a sense of what the risks might be. The other risk for a civilian photographer, or indeed any individual from the West who is on their own, is that they might become an element in the security situation. They might, for example, be taken hostage. And so they might become part of the problem rather than an observer of the problem.